turned over to noon. So we will go ahead and get started. It is 12 o'clock on October 21st, 2021. This is the meeting of the Race and the Criminal Justice System Subcommittee of the Criminal Justice Reform Commission. We'll go ahead and take a quick roll call. Mark Bennett, District Attorney in Sedgwick County. I'm sort of acting as the chair of this subcommittee for the moment, also the chair of the Criminal Justice Reform Commission. Let's see here. Natalie, if you wouldn't mind doing a quick roll call. Natalie Nelson, I will put that out there.
Hi, this is Natalie Nelson from Legislative Research. Let's see, Professor Phillips. Here. Shelley Williams.
Here.
Professor Francis.
He is not available. It may come later.
Chad Harmon. I don't see him. Sylvia Penner. Don't see her. Representative Finney.
Present.
Jonathan Ogletree. Don't see him. Curtis Barnes.
Present.
And Chief Mosley. That's all I have for the official members, I guess, and ad hoc.
Gotcha. Very good. So I need to also let you know that I have to leave a minute or two before 1. So if we're not done talking, I'm sure somebody else can finish up keeping the meeting going, but we'll let you know that because I've got another presentation to make at exactly 1 o'clock. So busy afternoon. A couple things I think we want to make sure we're getting to today. One, we had talked about training issues and the ability that CPOS might have to effectuate specific training for law enforcement officers. In that same discussion, and although it wouldn't be a CPOS specific thing, Shelley Williams had sent me an email earlier today suggesting that it would be possible to also take up like implicit bias training, make that mandatory for, I'll just say, probation generally, and she can get more details in the appropriate time, but we can bring that up as well. Pardon me, KBI's collection of evidence, I think was also a topic of discussion. Co-responder programs, and I think we had intended to talk just briefly about or talk about the gang lists. So those are the things we're going to try to accomplish. I know at the meeting on Monday, Representative Finney had asked, I think it started the discussion that led to Professor Portillo and I want to say Ms. Anderson, although I don't see her on just yet.
Dr. Anderson is having some trouble logging in.
Oh, okay.
I'm happy to start the presentation
Sure.
whenever you all are ready without her, but she is still trying to log in.
Well, to accommodate our guests here, I'll go ahead and give the floor to Professor Portillo, but just quickly, the idea was, I think all of us should know that the governor has set up a task force as well, related to many of the same issues. And the subcommittee here's idea is really just to make sure that anything that the larger commission is doing, that we're in our report, that we're paying attention to and putting pen to paper to describe the impact that some of these other subcommittees and then what the commission as a whole is doing might have, the impact it might have on race in the criminal justice system. And so while we're doing that and while we're having this conversation, it was Representative Finney suggested it'd be good to hear from you folks who have been working on the governor's task force. It's because it's very likely many of the things you are doing, we are also recommending or at least speaking to. We don't want to be at cross purposes with you, but we'd like to make sure that we're at least on the same page, or at least know where you're headed, even if we're not on the same page. So that was the genesis of your invitation. So with that, I will turn it over to you and you can give us an update on the governor's task force.
Well, thank you so much for inviting us here today. We do really appreciate the opportunity to present the work that we've been doing as part of our Commission for Racial Equity and Justice. And I see that Dr. Anderson has logged in just in time. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly, and Dr. Anderson and I will walk through a quick PowerPoint I hope you all can see that shared screen there. As I mentioned, we are presenting on the Governor's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice. I'll start by just providing a bit of a background on our commission. The governor signed an executive order in June of 2020, forming the Commission on Racial Equity and Justice. She asked our commission to study issues of racial equity and justice across multiple systems within the state of Kansas. So we focused first on policing and law enforcement, and we did that for 6 months in 2020 before producing our first report. But we're, as a commission, not focused exclusively on the criminal legal system, but rather we're looking more broadly at race and racial equity across multiple systems. Our commission includes perspectives from the criminal justice system, from education, healthcare, and advocacy organizations. So again, this isn't a commission on racial justice reform exclusively, but we did focus on racial justice reform as part of our early work. In 2021, our commission is focused on studying racial equity within economic systems, education, and healthcare. Our initial report was given to the governor in December of 2020, and that report did include over 60 recommendations to state agencies, the legislature, and local governments on how to improve racial equity in the state of Kansas. So we were very focused on the idea of providing specific recommendations to local governments as well as legislative recommendations, and then recommendations that the governor's office could put in place through administrative agencies. And I will turn it over to Dr. Anderson to talk about our process and timeline.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Representative Finney and all others who invited us here today. As we talk about process and timeline, as Dr. Portillo shared, really when we think about this work and you think about the criminal justice system, there are three prongs that we've identified that really feed that system, and that really are some of the legs on which injustices really stand on. As she mentioned, healthcare, education, and economics are those keys. So the commission's work has encompassed 11 meetings of the full commission. We hold those every other week since July. In the full commission meetings, we've heard from a number of experts on areas related to policing and law enforcement. Now, again, much of this is the early work as we talk about what happened initially, and then we go into where we are now. The National Governors Association was one of those presenters. They presented on the previous federal and state law enforcement reforms. We wanted to know what was out there previously and build from that. The Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center presented on what their current training was at that time. Tribal issues and law enforcement speakers presented on tribal interactions with the criminal justice system and tribal jurisdiction. The Kansas Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training presented. Judge Arnold Berger on the Pretrial Justice Task Force report presented really on pretrial and bail reform. State Board of Indigent Defense Services and Federal Public Defender's Office representatives presented, and then the Governor's Grants Office and the Attorney General funding law enforcement programs presented. So from that, we had several learning sessions, and in those learning sessions, in addition to those meetings, the Commission held 26 learning sessions with the community members and stakeholders, including those from law enforcement, healthcare, education, municipal government, and academic experts. Those included the community sessions in Wichita, Dodge City, Hutchinson, Topeka, and KCK, the State Board of Indigent Defense Services, the Kansas Association of Chiefs of Police, the Kansas Sheriff's Office, the Kansas Peace Officers Association. We had a learning session with the NOBLE, the National Organization of the Black Law Enforcement, and that was the Kansas chapter. We had learning sessions with the National Association of Women Law Enforcement Executives, the Kansas Mental Health Co-Responder Program, the American Civil Liberties Union of Kansas, and the League of Kansas Municipalities. Now, in addition to those learning sessions, we also really promoted our social media platform. People could call us, and some did, by phone, by email. That some mailed us letters. And then we had a Twitter hashtag that allowed us to follow continued conversation. So we had multiple prongs on which people could really dialogue, interact, and report out, and listen to those. Many of those sessions were videoed as well, and they're posted on the website. So the final item I will mention on process and timeline really is kind of that process that we have gone through. As the commission members heard from these experts on this very next and final slide that I'll speak to, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Portillo. The stakeholders that we listened to helped us begin to build the recommendations that led to those 60 recommendations. Once those recommendations were drafted, the commissioners all got feedback from those stakeholders that I just listed about the content and the language, and there were some edits and adjustments. And then the commission presented that final report to the governor, which you've seen, which was on December the 1st, 2021. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Portillo to talk a little bit about the recommendations from that very first report, then we'll talk about what we're doing now.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. So as Dr. Anderson mentioned, our first report included over 60 recommendations. And again, we broke those down for state agencies, the legislature, and local governments. So our recommendations in that first report focused on the criminal legal system broadly, including issues on law enforcement training, officer certification and standards, recruitment, retention, and promotion for police officers, accountability, how we actually collect and analyze data around law enforcement, the public defense system in the state of Kansas, some justice systems issues overall, and then specific recommendations for school resource officers, tribal jurisdictions, immigration and law enforcement, as well as behavioral health, and then broader issues of law enforcement funding. So we'll just pull out a few of our recommendations to kind of talk through. And these are all legislative recommendations given the focus of your work. The first is just prohibiting fired law enforcement officers from being hired at different law enforcement agencies. So requiring that an officer that's fired in one law enforcement agency for egregious offenses cannot be hired by a different law enforcement agency. So a law enforcement agency may choose to hire a law enforcement officer from another law enforcement agency for offenses not included as egregious in KSA 74-5616, but that would be at the discretion of the hiring entity. Then also mandating that there's a review of records during the hiring process. So this is really focused on the idea of information sharing between local jurisdictions. And we recommend that law enforcement agencies be required to check an officer's record with CPOST before making a hiring decision. Additionally, we hope that a national database is created soon so that law enforcement agencies can look across state lines. And we would require that agencies within the state of Kansas check that national database once it becomes available. Again, some kind of focus on hiring. The first would be a recommendation that we require psychological testing for officers performed by a licensed professional before certification. So current CPOST standards require psychological tests before certification, but not by an independent licensed professional. So this would just be putting a licensing requirement in place. And then we made a number of recommendations to the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center, including that they have training before a firearm is issued for use. Currently, officers may have their firearm issued before they're able to go to the academy, and we recommend that a firearm not be issued for provisionally certified law enforcement officers, but that we wait to arm officers until they've gone through all of the proper training. The 4 items that we've mentioned so far are all included in SB 247, which was introduced during this year's legislative session in the Senate Judiciary. Additionally, we recommended that CPOST increase the diversity of who is a part of their membership. So current requirements and statute define CPOST membership narrowly, and we suggest that they be updated to allow for more diversity, including racial, gender, and geographic diversity. This might include adding qualified professionals related to fields outside of law enforcement. Currently, CPOST is made up exclusively of law enforcement officers. And so expanding the reach beyond law enforcement, and then also potentially going a bit farther down in the hierarchy to include deputy chiefs and undersheriffs so that we have a bit more diversity on CPOST. And then one that has come up and been a big part of our work is considering amending the statute that requires citizenship for law enforcement officers within the state of Kansas. We recommend that the state align requirements with the U.S. military standards for service. So Kansas law KSA 74-5605 prohibits law enforcement agencies from hiring non-citizens who have legal status. And so this policy prevents agencies from taking advantage of legal permanent residents, green card holders, as well as DACA recipients and other potential community members who could be highly qualified. There are a number of veterans who are coming out of military service who currently don't have the ability to serve as law enforcement officers in the state of Kansas. And this would open up to decorated veterans as well as military eligible folks who have a bit more diversity.
So as we continue with these recommendations, additional recommendations in the area of healthcare include expanding Medicaid to provide mental health and other mental health care coverage to populations currently not covered. Law enforcement, community members, and leaders agree access to behavioral health care is a criminal justice issue. Many law enforcement encounters are the result of substance or mental health issues. Increasing access to this early intervention options by expanding Medicaid in Kansas would truly result in improving some policing outcomes. Expanding Medicaid would also reduce the state general fund spending on law enforcement and behavioral health. An additional recommendation is related to finance and supporting and financing the use of mobile crisis response models. This would include co-responder and virtual co-responder models to assist law enforcement in responding to behavioral health calls and those stops. Mental health professionals who ride with work alongside law enforcement officers can contribute to positive outcomes. This promotes treatment over incarceration for individuals experiencing mental health crisis situations. And Kansas communities should implement appropriate co-responder programs where possible.
And then we also recommend that we review racial and bias-based policing policies and complaints processes for law enforcement on the state level. So the legislature should review the racial and bias-based policing policies that were updated in statute in 2011 and determine if they're serving the intended purposes. Specifically, we asked the legislature to address the process for filing a complaint of racial or bias-based policing or other complaints related to law enforcement, such as use of force complaints, to ensure that the process is clear and accessible to Kansans. We'd like to know what entity is most appropriate to manage the process for filing these complaints and conducting an independent and thorough investigation to ensure that there are proper accountability measures and that there's availability of data related to complaints so that we can be responsive when it comes to how we move forward with this information in the future. Another thing that our commission spent quite a bit of time talking about is moving up within the profession of law enforcement. And so we suggested that the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center create a law enforcement supervisor training. So right now, there's a requirement for training when folks enter the profession, but really we want to see lifelong learning throughout that profession. So we suggest that KLETC should create a supervisor training program or academy, and all law enforcement officers promoted to a supervisory position should be required to attend that training within 6 months of promotion. The Supervisory Academy should require 40 hours of continued education yearly, which may take the place of the standard ongoing training requirements and should be specific to the leadership level. The supervisor training should focus on frontline supervisors and mid-level supervisors and include topics of public administration, law and society, management, leadership, and ethics, really targeting that growth throughout the profession. Again, there are about 60 recommendations in our initial report that was delivered in December of 2020, and that full report is on our website. If you go to our website, you'll also be able to see recordings of all of our meetings, as well as those learning sessions that Dr. Anderson mentioned. There were 11 meetings and 26 learning sessions that went into this first report, so there's quite a bit of information there. And we are happy to answer any questions you have about the first report, but I'll turn it over now to Dr. Anderson to talk about the work we've been doing within this year.
Right, as we briefly step through what's going on this year, at the very end, we'll stop and entertain questions and have dialogue about some of these areas that we've talked about. So as I started off saying that, injustice really sits on the heels of three things. They're the social determinants of health: economics, healthcare, and education. Access or lack thereof feed the system. Therefore, our focus really was on studying this topic. The commission heard repeatedly about overlapping and connecting issues in communities of color across the state. These issues are all connected to the social determinants of health, which has become the Commission's full focus for this report. Specifically, the three areas I've already shared really are where the recommendations will be falling. Similar to the last report, it'll be separated into legislative, municipal, and state recommendations. So the report will present two reports in the social determinants of health. There's one that came out July the 1st, 2021, and that really was just the first half of this full report. The remaining half of it will come out in December 2021, which will make one complete report. The July 2021 report, however, includes 51 recommendations on the following topics: early childhood and child care, federal legislation and funding, tax policy, teacher diversity, post-secondary education, school resource officers, school mascots, maternal and child health, and vaccine equity. Additional topics will be addressed in the December 1 report, and you should see the full report as both of those coming together.
So again, we broke down these recommendations into recommendations to state agencies, legislative recommendations, and local government recommendations. And so we talked quite a bit with the governor's tax policy committee, as well as work within our own subcommittee on economic systems. And we've made the recommendation that the legislature reinstate the food sales tax rebate. So the state should implement a refundable food sales tax income tax credit. According to the Governor's Council on Tax Reform, such a credit would benefit as many as 400,000 Kansas households to help offset state and local sales taxes paid on groceries. This proposal creates targeted relief to low and moderate income taxpayers, which communities of color are disproportionately represented in those groups. And we also have recommendations around health, so maternal and child health, to improve the health of children by reducing the number of uninsured children through enabling continuous coverage for children ages 0 to 5. Kansas is one of the states with a growing number of uninsured children. In 2019, there were 9,000 fewer Kansas children who had health coverage than in 2016. Black, Indigenous, and children of color are nearly twice as likely to be uninsured as white children, 7.8% versus 4.2% in the state of Kansas. And Kansas can reduce the number of children who turn off of Medicaid due to red tape and administrative reasons by implementing a policy to ensure that all Kansans have continuous coverage for ages 0 through 5.
So as we go to this last section, as you may have already noted that, Dr. Portillo talked about economics because she's chairing the subcommittee on economics. I'm chairing the subcommittee on education, and Commissioner David Jordan is chairing the subcommittee on health. So as I go into the education piece, I want you to think about what she just mentioned in regards to the insurance and the uninsured children, because we in Topeka public schools are really focusing on the school to prison pipeline, and what feeds that in part are some mental health issues that are rather significant. And imagine the number of uninsured young people who can't access the care they need. Therefore, they find themselves in the juvenile detention center rather quickly at the middle school age and beyond. And disproportionately, these are young people of color. Having said that, I'll revert to talking about post-secondary and early childhood care and education. We are recommending that there's continued support for scholarships for tuition assistance through programs such as the Kansas Promise Scholarship Act. The state should continue to support and expand on policies such as the Kansas Promise Scholarship Act, which provides scholarships for students attending eligible post-secondary institutions in Kansas for any 2-year associate degree program or career technical education certificate or standalone program otherwise identified by the Kansas Board of Regents. As a side piece, and when we finish, we certainly can answer questions. Currently, I mentioned that school to prison pipeline work in Topeka. We're actually partnering right now with the university setting to see how we can open up more college access to incarcerated individuals. So just knowing that this piece of post-secondary education is a critical component of the work and what you're going to see in recommendations coming forward. Under the early childhood and child care area, one of the recommendations that we pulled to share was improving the Kansas Child Daycare Assistance Credit. I think this is one of the larger pieces that really could allow for families to have immediate impact. The Child Care Assistance Credit is an existing tax credit administered by the Kansas Department of Revenue and intended to encourage businesses to help their employees find childcare, either by providing childcare services directly or providing assistance in locating services as needed. Kansas can improve the program and expand utilization with just a few policy changes, such as expanding the type of businesses eligible for that credit, eliminating the reduction of benefits that occurs after the first year when covering the cost of on-site childcare, and expanding the types of eligible qualifications and activities. Those are just some of the recommendations in the current report. The full report is available online on the website, along with the recordings of the meetings and learning sessions held by the Commission and the documents used in the development of those recommendations. That does conclude our presentation, and we'll turn it over to Dr. Portillo as we entertain questions.
Any questions for either Dr. Anderson or Dr. Professor Portillo concerning the work of the Governor's Task Force? If I don't see, I'm trying to look, if kind of raise your hand if you have any questions. I'll say that listening to you, I think you confirmed a suspicion that many of us had, which is I think we're covering some of the same ground you already did. And so I think it would be important to give some voice to the fact, and we have a report due December 1st ourselves, and just at least acknowledge the work done by your task force, that many of the same issues we're attending to have already been worked over by you guys. Specifically, the whole mention of police training, excuse me, in that Senate Bill 247. This was something we were going to discuss today ourselves. Medicaid expansion is something that I know is frankly controversial. It's may hit some roadblocks, but I know that I'm on a lot of task forces, but on a different task force I'm a part of, it's the mental health task force down here in Sedgwick County. And our sheriff always talks frequently about the impact that someone gets arrested for ill behavior. Most of the time, it's a revolving door. People go in, they go out, they're in and out very quickly, a matter of days. Long sentences are not, in fact, the norm. But even a couple, 48 hours, 72 hours can upset somebody's benefits, and it takes them a while to get back on, and then they miss their casework because they don't have insurance, and it's just a kind of a ever expanding cycle. So I know that is something that many groups are attending to, but it certainly has a political component to it. So any other comments, though? I want to dominate the conversation here. Any other comments for either of our two speakers here today?
Mr. Chairman.
Please.
Shelley
Shelley.
Williams.
Yeah.
Community Corrections in Manhattan, Kansas. And I was just wondering if you ladies would have off the top of thinking recommendations on what type of annual training should probation, supervision officers, parole officers participate in or be required to participate in on an annual ongoing basis?
That's a great question. And I will say that within our first report, we did not have a large focus on community corrections. So I think a lot of my work really focuses on problem solving courts and courtroom work teams. And we're seeing a rise in drug courts and mental health courts. And I would say that at the local level, it'd be incredibly helpful if we had probation officers and community corrections officers who had more of a background in what some of these problem solving courts can do and access to services. Because as Mr. Bennett mentioned, and we do have a lot of folks who even a 24-hour or 72-hour being incarcerated for 24 to 72 hours means that they become cut off from medications, from social supports. And so having probation officers who can help navigate some of those systems and connect offenders to services would be incredibly helpful.
I'll add to that, and as Dr. Portillo mentioned, while the report doesn't go in depth into that particular area, one of the things we mentioned in training within the report and throughout it is implicit bias training. It's, I think, critical with whatever arena you're in to have some level of training in that area. And that came up from officers, it came up from public defender. I mean, that came up across the board of understanding that people come from the experiences in which they have, and to understand at a deeper level the role implicit bias plays, I think may change what access and opportunities you're able to link people to as you understand your own bias as well. So I would encourage that in the immediate future. As a side note for Topeka, since we oversee, my school district oversees the JDC, the Juvenile Detention Center, we are now piloting a new project, and I am excited to see the outcome of this piece. We took a retired principal, had them come out of retirement, and they restudied where are all the students coming from, the ones that at least are in Topeka, and they're coming from the highest poverty, highest minority schools. That's the school to prison pipeline feeder for the juvenile correctional facility for at least Topeka Public Schools. Now, we take kids from other places, but just for Topeka Public Schools, we have that person now placed as an administrator, almost like a principal, at the correctional facility with our teachers. And then half day, they are mentoring and working with the students that are the feeder from the elementary and the middle. And then the implicit bias training is now a requirement for all groups that touch these young people. And so I think that collaboration and that collective impact, which you'll hear a little bit about collective impact in our current report, but that is to me a key piece to really look at how do we wrap services around in that kind of collaborative manner.
Great, thank you both.
Okay. I'll just final thought here before we kind of shift gears is when you talk about the three prongs of what you called injustice, health, economic, and education access. We've used a little different terms, but we have mentioned several times throughout the life of the Reform Commission the three stabilizing factors. Just a different way of looking at the same thing. We've identified housing, access to treatment, so mental health, drug, alcohol treatment, and then employment. So we use different language, but essentially we're getting the same thing you are from kind of a different angle. So
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And
all
now
arrive kind of at the same place.
And it's reaffirming that you're finding the same things we're finding, and we're two very separate committees, but that lets you know how real it is. And housing is a big piece of this upcoming report, both in Dr. Portillo's Subcommittee of Economics, and then we had a very large housing piece in education as well. It all intertwines with one another. And so if there's work in the future in us looking at your recommendations as we embed things in ours, and certainly our early reports are already posted, I think it only strengthens the work that both groups are doing as we are replicating each other's recommendations, perhaps to some degree. But both of those things that you just mentioned fall under economics, and in some cases education as well. So excited about the work ahead. And again, thank you so much just for taking the time, investing the time to learn about what we're doing and to engage in this discussion. Thank you
for your time. You're welcome for the next 30 minutes or so to join us for the rest of it and listen and ask any questions. But unless anyone has any more questions for either Dr. Anderson or Professor Portillo, I will thank them for the time.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Thank you, Dr. Portillo. Thank you very much.
See, I could tell you wanted to say something, Gail. All right. Well, let's turn a kind of a very a minor turn here back to the first issue at hand, which is consistent with what we've just talked about. And Chief Hooper was on the Reform Commission meeting Monday and said he would be in a position to talk to us a little bit about, just give us a better understanding of how training, when a training idea is submitted to CPOST, we want you to train on thus and such, and we'll give you a discrete issue, de-escalation or implicit bias, whatever the thing may be. How is a curriculum developed? How is it voted upon? What is that process? I give you a request. Walk us through briefly what it takes to get that onto the books and into the classrooms or into the continuing ed for officers across the state?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that that's a very valid question on how that process really takes place. You know, it's obviously occurred when we talk about implicit bias training and bias-based policing practices, because those are mandated by state statute for every law enforcement officer in the state. So KLETC, obviously, Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center, is a training arm of CPOST, or training arm for the state law enforcement. And so when a mandate comes in for training, that would go through CPOST first. CPOST then would communicate with KLETC on the development of that training curriculum, which then would have to come back to the CPOST Commission for approval. Recently, just this last year, KLETC completely revamped their entire training curriculum for law enforcement basic training. We then reviewed that entire curriculum for approval before it has to be implemented. So that would be the process. It would be relatively seamless, but I think that one of the important factors from the CPOST perspective, and it was pointed out in the previous presentation, is that the stakeholders involved in that, and I'll talk specifically about diversity training, because that's one of the things that in the governor's report that they're referencing, we've already discussed at CPOST. And part of that was we should not have police officers teaching police officers about diversity, right? We should have people that are experts in that realm, in that community, teaching law enforcement about diversity. So what does that look like, and who are those experts, and how do we bring them into that training curriculum? And so those are all challenges that I think that CPOST would need some mentoring and guidance on how the commission, or how they want us to roll that out across the state, and then we would direct KLETC in such a manner.
So if we came up with a bill, or a recommendation, I should say, that the commission, so this subcommittee makes a recommendation to the larger commission, and our recommendation is that, consistent with other voices that have been going on in this arena, so the governor's task force, and I'm sure this commission and that task force are not the only ones in this conversation, but that CPOST needs to develop over the next 18 months a ongoing training in this arena, and specifically in that topic. Is it something that needs to be a bill in terms of we need to change state law? Is it a recommendation that the governor simply make an administrative order? What do you need? What bill has to be rung for this to go into effect?
Yeah, an executive order, certainly, given the CPOST, would accomplish that, in which that would be a requirement from the governor's office. And the CPOST would task, obviously, KLETC to do that. But much like racial and bias-based policing as a statute that's required for law enforcement, that then holds the feet to the fire on a long-term basis, sets a specific standard for that. And so that would be the preference, I'm sure, from the CPOST commission, that it was a statute-driven approach.
So I'll ask Representative Finney and Senator Haley. I know Representative Owens let me know he had a unexpected commitment. He couldn't make it today. I'll ask our two legislators. If I have a goal in all of this, it's to be pragmatic. I want to make sure we do things that aren't just nice ideas, but actually get something accomplished. And unfunded mandates often are met with resistance. And so I'm wondering if we ask something like the following: we either ask for an executive order to task CPOST with beginning this process, so that and at the end of that executive order, there's a requirement that CPOST or its representatives come back to the legislature in the 2022 session then. Excuse me, I guess 2023 session. I'm forgetting what next year's 2022, excuse me. With the plan that they're going to do, and then make that a statute? Or would it be better to put all that into a statute right off the bat and say, all I'm getting at is we're going to need to give them a little time. If you say this thing has to be going by June 1st of next year, it sounds to me like that's probably a bit optimistic, but to give them to say that by a certain date, January 1st of 2023, something like that, they have a year to develop the program and then roll it out at that point. As legislators, what do you think is the most palatable for the legislature, so it doesn't just get lost in the den of other legislation? I'll ask Representative Finney or Senator Haley.
Yeah.
No,
Gail?
I would suggest the legislation route. I mean, because you could always introduce legislation and still get the executive route as well.
Sure.
You could do both simultaneously.
Okay. Senator Haley, any thoughts to add to that?
And I would concur. I do like the pragmatism, though, of having the force coming from one branch, that being the executive, to at least say this is something that we certainly want to see considered as the legislation makes its way near simultaneously through. If CPOST is moving or would be moving toward promulgating what seem to be consistent recommendations, so pleased to hear the report that was just given, that they seem to be consistent with other findings. So if we hear the same voices saying the same thing, but from different places, be it an executive or legislative from different commissions like ours and others, I think as many times as we could hear it from as many different places with as many different directives may one day help us get it across the finish line.
Okay. Back to Chief Hooper real quick. So you've got bias-based policing on board. That's already state law. We're talking about implicit bias. I don't want to just use a different term to identify the same thing. I mean, all we can really do in the subcommittee is make a recommendation, and the commission can make a recommendation as well. I mean, we don't have the authority of law, but I want to make sure we're all clear on what it is we're recommending. And that is, we've talked about de-escalation. We've talked about, I'm looking at notes from our last meeting from September, chokeholds, car stops. I mean, there's lots of very discrete issues here, but I think the umbrella that you're talking about here really is de-escalation. And then with respect to implicit bias training, Professor Phillips had mentioned that. I think Gene's still on the call. I think in my mind is that is something in addition to or different than bias-based policing, but
in definition, it is different, but part of that bias-based policing curriculum that comes out of KLETC and is taught across the state includes and emphasizes implicit bias. And so I think we would be basically asking them to duplicate the same thing that is already occurring across the state. That's a huge part of that. And so I think with the governor's task force report and what you're referencing, there's no doubt that the two bigger terms there are the de-escalation and probably diversity training, in which we had at the CPOST Commission discussed a lot that diversity training piece. And one of the things that you had mentioned was unfunded mandates. From the CPOST Commission's perspective, or from KLETC's perspective, that is not going to be an issue. KLET is funded through the state. CPOST obviously is funded the same way. Commissioners were volunteers on that. But where that will become an issue is with the chiefs, the sheriffs, the police officers, those organizations that will get an unfunded mandate for training. And so we will get some, and I'm all for it. My agency is rather large, and so we can afford to do that. But some of these smaller agencies will not be able to do that. And so we need to look at it in a manner in which we can roll it out to law enforcement across the state and make it easily accessible to them to help ease in that burden a little bit.
so maybe if we make a recommendation to the commission to recommend then to the legislature that statute be promulgated or the existing statute be amended to add explicitly de-escalation training related to de-escalation and training related to diversity. Repeat myself: diversity training on diversity training. And really, what I think what I'm hearing is we're talking about not so much. Maybe de-escalation, I think, would be for the rookies, kids coming straight out of the school. But what I'm getting at is, I think it's important though for the continuing ed, for the cops that are already on the street, not just the guys going to the academy. Could be both, but am I on the same page with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that part of the basic training curriculum right now does include diversity, does include de-escalation, does include implicit bias. And so I really think what we're talking about, just like the bias-based policing mandate, is a mandate for annual refresher training for every law enforcement agent, every law enforcement officer in the state.
What's a normal hourly requirement yearly for other types of updates? I need to be updated on how to use, databases and whatnot. I mean, what would be appropriate?
Yeah, I think that's where we're weak in our required training. The state requires 40 hours of continuing education training for every law enforcement officer annually to remain certified, but it does not dictate what that training is. Even in the bias-based police training, there's no hourly requirement. That could be 30 minutes, it could be an hour, it could be 2 hours. And so I think anything that we drive forward in reference to these specific topics, we should mandate a specific level of training to make sure that we're getting through the education that we need. And I'm thinking a minimum of 2 hours training blocks for each one of those various topics.
For lawyers, we have to have at least 2 hours of ethics training every year, and many of us get more, but it's just
Right.
a basement there. So I don't mean to dominate the conversation, just two of us. I want to open this up to others based on what I just wanted to try to make quick work of art because we have a lot of time here.
I have,
Yeah.
Mr. Bennett, do you remember the other day, and I said I had a suggestion?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
want
Oh,
you
yeah.
all to listen to.
Sure.
Well, that suggestion, I was surprised to learn today that the Racial Equity Committee had the same suggestion, but I was wanting to know you all's opinion about creating diversity on the C-Post board or commission.
Racial-
Adding a space
When you
for
say
someone.
diversity, what do you mean?
Okay, I mean, creating, to update the statute to maybe include someone from the community or, with different diversity, like in racial, sex, someone that's not necessarily a police officer, but maybe it might mean expanding it for 1 or 2 members, but to get an outside viewpoint or someone that's directly impacted with the community to be a part of that board when they're making those decisions.
Yeah, I understand. Any thoughts or comments on that
Yeah,
obviously
that's
it's
one of the
already-
recommendations that organization just had, but I know
Exactly.
there's a couple more organizations that looking at, and like including myself, to be quite honest, looking at doing legislation to expand C-Post to include people that aren't necessarily in law enforcement but are directly impacted, not necessarily victims, but someone that has more familiarity with a particular community. So I just wondering what your opinion was on that.
One quick question for the chief. How many board members are there? I can't remember on C-Post.
There are 12 commission members.
Okay.
And it's made up, we do have one, the chair of that committee actually is minority member who is on the city council for Wichita.
Yeah, Brandon Johnson, yes.
Yep, and so he chairs that committee, but the rest of the committee, there are 3 sheriffs on there, 3 chiefs on there, a county attorney. So everybody else on the committee is in the criminal justice field. And speaking for myself, and I am a 100% in favor of law enforcement reform and looking at how we can do things better and opening up that scope. And I'm all for, and I'm just one commissioner out of 12, but I'm all for expanding that commission to include some experts in the field that can help guide training and police standards from a different perspective outside of the criminal justice or law enforcement field.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you, Mr. Hooper. I appreciate that.
Well, one of the
Mr.
things we
Bennett?
could do, so one of the things we could do is, that's why I was asking for the numbers here, so we've already got a non-law enforcement member as the chair. It seems to me adding, as you said, another couple of people. I'm thinking when we formed this commission, in fact, when the legislature formed this very commission, they were very explicit. They wanted people from different walks of life, in the legislation. And I'm wondering if maybe somebody from academia, like a Professor Portillo type of a person who works in this, Professor Phillips, somebody who works in the criminal justice arena. That would be an option. Rather than being real specific, it seems to me when we give some options to the legislature so they can hash it out. But I'm thinking somebody either from academia or from, as you say, the communities themselves. So often, like in our commission, we have somebody from the clergy who represents African American communities. Just advocacy groups. There's different places to draw from. And by doing it that way, you make it a little less political. It's not just some governor handpicking somebody. It's somebody who actually comes from an identified organization. So,
So as a commission, can we make that a part of our recommendation?
Yeah, we can.
The commission is set up very specifically as well, if you look at the makeup of it, because there's every size agency in the state is represented. So you get one chief from cities of the first class, one chief city of second class and third class. Same thing with the sheriffs, to try to create that sense that everybody is included in that as well. And so I think that anything that we would lay out should be along some of those lines as well, so that large cities, small cities, things of that nature are represented.
We're not too urban, too rural, we try to keep a cross section of the state. So, okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Shelley.
Representative Shelley Williams. Both of our advisory board for corrections, both guiding statutes require that at least 2 members of each corrections advisory board shall be representative of ethnic minorities, and no more than 2/3 of the members of each board shall be from the same gender. Let me turn the page. From the same sex. And I'm just wondering, there is precedence there.
Yeah.
While it's challenging, especially in more rural communities, to meet that, that you do have at least 2 members from ethnic minorities, it's been nothing but beneficial in the guiding of our programming. And so there is precedence for that. And maybe that's something that we want to consider recommending.
I'm looking at the clock here and recognizing I've got a deadline. I've got to step off here. That doesn't mean we have to shut it down, but I'll maybe hand it over to Shelley. You're right here. I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't mind finishing up at 1 o'clock when I have to step out. But
that's fine.
I think maybe what we do here is we're not going to be in a position probably today to vote on any particular draft because one's not been done. What I'll do is ask everybody to be available maybe sometime early next month for one more meeting of this board. And in the meantime, or the subcommittee, excuse me, in the meantime, I'll try to take a stab at drafting a proposed report to be submitted. And in there, I'll try to incorporate some of these. And Shelley, if you wouldn't mind sending me that statute number, it'll save me 10 minutes looking it up.
For sure.
You're right. When legislation goes smoother, when it's based upon something that's already existing. So if there's a bill, if you've got language that applies to community corrections, I want to make sure it's in keeping with the bill that's already there for C-Post. We go and create something out of whole cloth, it's not going to get anywhere. But let's use language that is already defined, already been reviewed and vetted, and you have a lot more success down the road. And just trying to enhance the diversity of C-Post and the number of voices in the room, I think everybody agrees is a good idea. So
I'd like to add one more thing that may ease when you're writing, this is Chief Hooper, when you're writing that currently right now, for example, the Kansas Association of Chiefs of Police, that organization makes recommendations to the governor, usually narrows it down to 2 or 3 candidates to fill an empty seat for chiefs, and then the governor makes her selection. It may benefit us if we are going to request to add members, is that some organization then makes those requests to the governor, similar to the way the other seats are filled.
Yeah, I'm the representative of the Kansas District Attorneys Association, for instance. Everybody here was
right.
Submitted by somebody. So, okay,
right.
Very good. Any other comments or questions on this training issue for Chief Hooper? I want to make sure everybody had a chance to be heard. Okay. We've also talked at some extent about collection of evidence, KBI, the type of information they're able to collect. Unless I'm drawing a blank here on whether or not anybody was going to speak on that specifically today. I don't think so. If I'm mistaken, somebody will jump in, but if not, I'll put something in the report that simply says in keeping with what frankly a lot of folks have talked about, again, I think it was referenced even by the 2 speakers today. I know it's something we've talked about throughout the life of the commission, that is any ability to enhance the amount of information collected by law enforcement to detail the types of stops they're making, who's involved in the stops, contact with law enforcement, et cetera. These are terms that have to be defined, and it's not something that we can just simply make a sweeping statement about, but enhanced availability of data, I think, helps all of us. And I will just tell you personally, trying to go back and do something as simple as identify how many people by race, gender, ethnicity are coming on the front door through my office has proven to be far more difficult than I expected it to be. We're working on it. It's going to take us a while. But the best time, as best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago. And the way you get better at this is if we start having these conversations now, so that over the course of the next year or two, KBI could add a few data points, for things to be turned in by sheriffs when people are booked and that sort of thing. I think we get better data that can drive future decisions for the legislature. So long way of saying, I think I'll put something in here about that we all agree that the need for enhanced access to data is an important topic for the legislature to address. Fair statement?
Hello?
Yes. What do we got here?
Enhanced access, this is David Haley, is important, but also enhanced data, is a concern. The access to it is one thing, but right now for the collection in and of itself during stops, be they motorist or even pedestrian, often could prove that there's certain hot spots in an area that probably needs some attention, that there's a disproportionate amount if that data, but right now we don't even collect that we don't even have the collection in place. I know Missouri does, by the way, and it's county of origin. It's not just, racial data or gender data, it's county of origin, and checking those boxes might help if we could consider including that as well.
Gotcha. Yep. I didn't mean to imply that access didn't also mean enhanced collection. You got to, doesn't do much good to have access to a lot of uninformed data. You need the information in the first place. So agreed. Okay.
Thank you.
We talked about co-responder programs. I'll be honest with you. We've all agreed. I haven't heard anyone talk about, offering any sort of opposition to co-responder programs. But the reality is it's a topic in and of itself that we could have put a subcommittee together just to address. So it's a difficult thing for us just to speak about too intelligently here, other than to say we agree with it. But I do think that there's also agreement that there's a cost associated with this, and so I think it's something that is worth further study by the legislature. It seems to me that I'll come up with something in a positive way that puts that in a positive note and suggest that the legislature again give its attention to enhancing the access to co-responder programs. But I'd be hesitant to require it or suggest that it be required just yet until more studies are done and frankly we address the access issue. Not every community is going to have trained, qualified co-responders to go out with cops, and so I think it's a kind of a step-by-step process. Any other discussion about the co-responder programs? Okay, the last thing I had in my notes from last time then was the gang membership, gang lists. That is something that has been discussed. It is being discussed. The ACLU has a current lawsuit involved in Wichita PD on that topic. Again, I'm not sure it's something we're going to resolve today or even in the subcommittee, but I know it is the subject. It is on the minds of others. I think we at least can point out that it's something that needs to be followed by the legislature. My guess is they're going to wait until the lawsuit is resolved one way or the other before anybody in the legislature is going to want to jump in. They're going to want to see what the courts do. But it's something we can at least acknowledge is an issue and may deserve attention of the legislature in future years after that lawsuit is resolved and there's some guidance from the courts. So, okay, I'm going fast. I apologize, but I just want to make sure I'd at least address the things I think we wanted to address last time. What else is on anyone's mind? I asked that question with the full disclosure that I got to leave here in about 2 minutes. So I'll turn it over to Shelley if there's further discussion, if she wouldn't mind leading the balance of the meeting today. But anything else that people wanted to make sure was in the discussion? Lastly, I'll leave you with this. I'll get with Natalie. We'll get one more meeting put together so we can vote on and just discuss the report. But anything else you wanted to talk about that we haven't talked about thus far?
Mr. Chairman, I had sent you that email this morning and about training for supervision officers. And so if that could just maybe be our wrap-up conversation.
Sure.
Okay.
Go ahead. I'll give you the floor, and I'll thank everybody for your time on this, and I'll see you next next time.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I had realized through other subcommittees that we had kind of neglected to talk about supervision officers in Kansas in regards to race and justice. And so I sent a recommendation this morning saying that I felt like it should be a mandate that all new staff, whether they are community corrections officers, court service officers with OJA, or parole officers with KDOC, participate in an implicit bias training, both as new staff and then annual refresher training ongoing. And so I thought it was important that I do a little research before I made my recommendation. And so I went out, and I'm going to share my screen really quick. This is from the standards manual from the Kansas Department of Corrections. Can everybody see that okay? It's really small, so I have to make you bigger here. Okay.
I can see it, Shelley.
Okay, thank you. And so this is they're called state standards, supervision standards. And as community corrections agencies, we have to follow the standards that the Department of Corrections puts in place. And so regarding training for supervision staff, it's only a suggestion that, and it's called workplace diversity here, that we participate in some type of, whether that be, it's listed twice, or workplace diversity and cultural diversity. And I guess I just feel like that suggestion needs to be a recommendation from the subcommittee, that it actually be a requirement. We are interacting with hundreds and hundreds of folks across the state. And I really feel like we need to know our implicit biases, and we also need to know how to provide services to this population that we it's not required. And so I'm just hoping that that is something that this committee would consider. And I apologize for the lateness in the recommendation, but again, this is just a suggestion by the Kansas Department of Corrections. It's not a requirement that we participate. And I do not know, I apologize, what my counterparts at both court services and parole are required to participate in. I'm not familiar with that. So, oh, Jonathan's on here. Maybe he knows what the parole officers have to participate in, but maybe he doesn't, because he's not in that loop. But
well, since you put it out there, Shelley.
Not to put you on the spot.
No, I think that's the same directive the parole officers have to fall under, because they are under the Department of Corrections. But I think you make an excellent point there, that sort of like sexual harassment is a required course. I think implicit bias should be a required course also, and define better that people in those type position needs to participate in that training annually. So I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Okay, thank you. Other points of discussion for supervision officers across the state?
I would recommend, because there's already a statute. This is Chief Hooper, Shelley. Oh, it's good to see you.
Good to see you.
I would recommend, there's already a state mandate for law enforcement officers, and I think it'd be really easy to roll that right into that same statute that applies to law enforcement. I think that would be the easiest lift.
Okay. Do you think you could forward me that number, that statute number?
Yeah, I will look that up and ship it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anyone else on the committee or not officially on the committee? I'd love to hear from you.
So Shelley, I just wanted to mention, since the chief mentioned it there, would it be an easier task just to kind of loop in correctional staff? That would include the supervision officers and the individuals that working with the population across the board. So if we put law enforcement and correctional staff, that would kind of encompass everyone.
I like that, because that would be the jails too, and the prisons.
Yes.
Great idea. Thanks, Jonathan.
Curtis Barnes with Johnson County Pretrial Services.
Hi.
Although I would agree with that as far as the implicit bias part, because, you know, I'm a pretrial assessment officer, and I don't think we have any kind of training like that here in Johnson County.
Thank you for saying that. Senator Haley, any thoughts?
No, in terms of the supervision that's given, that's kind of the realm that, you know, I look to stakeholders and those who are the professionals in this realm to help us promulgate how we find a better path. This is the area that I personally rely on your expertise and insights.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Well, I will kind of summarize what we've talked about here the last few minutes and get some statute numbers and examples for Mr. Bennett to put in our final report, and look forward to the leaders taking this and getting it into policy. So, all right. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day, and we'll see you soon.